There are horror films that frighten us with monsters, shadows, or the violence that fills the screen. And then there are films that haunt us because of something we can't point to, something we can't see. A pressure behind the eyes, a sudden tightness in the chest, a shiver that rises for no reason at all. Many viewers blame the story, the imagery, or the atmosphere, but a smaller group, the more sensitive ones, swear that what truly terrified them was the sound. Hidden beneath the orchestral swells and ambient drones, some films use techniques that were never meant for casual audiences. Low-frequency tones that cause unease on a biological level. Instruments pushed beyond their natural range. Tape loops altered to create distortions the human ear interprets as danger. And in a few rare cases, there are whispers of something even stranger. Tracks rumored to contain frequencies discouraged, even banned from commercial use, or audio so unsettling that the composers themselves refuse to revisit it. Tonight, we uncover the films where the soundtrack didn't just support the horror, it created it. These are the movies that shook viewers without a single frightening frame, the ones whose audio triggered migraines, nausea, insomnia, or that eerie feeling of something watching. Whether these effects were intentional experiments or accidents buried in the mix, one thing is certain: the sound was never supposed to do that. Fact 1. The Witch Who Came from the Sea, 1976. On the surface, The Witch Who Came from the Sea is a moody character study bathed in dreamlike visuals. But the film's unnerving emotional tone stems from far more than its narrative. It comes from a soundtrack intentionally built to induce dissociation. Composer Herschel Burke Gilbert designed a score shaped around wavering microtonal intervals, avoiding traditional harmonies in favor of pitches that fall between standard notes. When layered with analog tape flutter, these tones wobble unpredictably, creating subtle physiological discomfort. Viewers often describe feeling emotionally seasick during scenes that should feel calm. The film also incorporates field recordings captured along the California coast, crashing waves, cavernous wind tunnels, and distant machinery. But these weren't used literally. Instead, they were processed through filters that removed their natural attack, leaving behind ghostly, resonant pads. These ambient textures suggest movement without source, a sensation that mimics the protagonist's fractured perception. Perhaps most disturbing are the barely audible vocal bends hidden under key emotional beats. These lines were recorded at whisper level, spoken by uncredited actors reading improvised monologues about memory and regret. Gilbert instructed the performers to speak with uneven breaths, creating a fragile texture that dissolves into the mix. Many viewers never consciously register these whispers, but they contribute to the film's sense of drifting psychological collapse. Unlike many films on this list, The Witch Who Came from the Sea has a soundtrack release, but it omits most of the experimental textures, leaving only the melodic skeleton. The original mix survives only in theatrical prints, making the film a rare example of sonic dissociation encoded directly into the audience's nervous system. Fact 2. Phase 4, 1974. Although Phase 4 is remembered for its striking macro photography of ants, the film's most unsettling qualities originate in its experimental soundscape. Director Saul Bass wanted the audience to experience communication as the ants do not through language, but through vibration, resonance, and frequency. The result is a soundtrack that feels alien, physical, and deeply invasive. The audio team generated insect communication sounds using synthetic pulses, analog tone generators, and slowed-down recordings of real ant movements. These layers were merged to create rhythmic patterns that sit close to the lower limit of hearing. Many viewers describe the effect as a pressure in the room, rather than a sound. Some of these tones fall near 15-18 Hz, a range known to trigger anxiety, eye strain, or a sensation of being watched. Accompanying these frequencies are metallic chirps and distorted clicking sounds, manipulated to feel both mechanical and organic. The unpredictability of these sounds mirrors the ants' intelligence, making the audience feel as though something unseen is tracking their movements. Even the human dialogue is subtly altered. In several scenes, room tone shifts dramatically without visual explanation, creating an unease that seems to come from the environment itself. Bass believed sound could suggest evolution or a higher intelligence more effectively than visuals, and the film's atmosphere proves him right. The climax pushes this concept further, embedding tones designed to unsettle the nervous system as the ants exert their growing influence. While often overshadowed by its imagery, the sound design of Phase 4 remains one of the most ambitious experiments in biologically targeted audio, turning an ecological thriller into a frequency-based psychological assault. Fact 3. Malatesta's Carnival of Blood, 1973. Malatesta's Carnival of Blood looks like a low-budget fever dream, but the film's true power lies not in its visuals, bizarre as they are, but in its audio architecture, which remains one of the strangest in 1970 seconds. Horror. The sound mix feels disjointed, unpredictable, and vaguely hostile, as though the carnival itself is communicating through broken speakers. The production's most infamous experiment involved recording empty carnival rides at night, capturing the shrieks of metal joints, the resonance of hollow structures, and random vibrations caused by wind. These sounds were then pitch-shifted, slowed, and looped into cycles that don't fit any musical time signature. The result is a disorienting, cyclical drone that creates a sense of being trapped in a place that refuses to obey physics. In addition, the audio team built several cues using malfunctioning reel-to-reel recorders, which produced inconsistent playback speed. These fluctuations created bending tones that mimic vertigo, often hitting frequencies that audiences perceive as nausea-inducing. One sound mixer later described the project as a nightmare of broken equipment, and that's exactly why it worked. The film also experimented with multi-source whispers, using layered recordings from actors muttering nonsensical dialogue. These were scattered across channels, sometimes panning abruptly or fading abruptly, simulating the sensation of voices moving behind the viewer. During early screenings, several audience members reportedly turned around in confusion, believing someone was standing directly behind their seats. With no official soundtrack release and damaged audio elements, many aspects of the original mix have never been fully documented. To this day, Malatesta's Carnival of Blood remains a unique case of audio psychedelia weaponized for horror, transforming a low-budget film into an acoustic hallucination. Fact 4. Images 1972. Though Images presents itself as an introspective psychological drama, its sound design transforms the film into a deeply unsettling auditory hallucination. Robert Altman and composer John Williams crafted an aural architecture that mirrors the protagonist's fractured mental state, using sound not as accompaniment but as a direct extension of psychological breakdown. The score abandons traditional melody in favor of atonal clusters, performed with bowed metal, crystal glasses, and unconventional percussion. These sounds vibrate at unstable intervals, producing a delicate but penetrating discomfort. Williams collaborated with percussionist Stomu Yamashita, whose sharp, metallic hits slice through the soundtrack like sudden intrusions of thought. These bursts are intentionally irregular, mirroring the protagonist's splintering sense of reality. The film also employs dislocated environmental cues, running water in scenes where no faucet is present, distant knocking with no visual source, and sudden shifts in room tone that leave the viewer momentarily disoriented. These auditory ghosts blur the boundary between external world and internal chaos. Most disturbing are the whisper fragments embedded in quiet sequences. These are not clear words, but drifting breaths and broken syllables, processed to resemble thoughts escaping before they form. Sound engineers admitted these sessions were emotionally draining. The material felt too intimate, as though the mix were invading the listener's mind. Unlike most films of its era, Images uses sound as a psychological weapon, creating a constant tug between reality and imagination. It is less a soundtrack than a sonic representation of madness, leaving the viewer unsure which sounds are real and which belong to the protagonist's unraveling mind. Fact 5. The Sentinel, 1977. The Sentinel is often remembered for its shocking finale and star-studded cast, but audiophiles know it as one of the most strategically unsettling sound mixes of the decade. While the visual effects are dated, the film's audio continues to disturb because it relies on biologically intrusive frequencies layered beneath its orchestral score. The production used an experimental device known as a subharmonic generator, which produced deep bass waves that rattled the body more than the ear. These tones were blended into scenes involving the apartment building's mysterious tenants, creating a sense of pressure and impending collapse. Projectionists in New York and Los Angeles reported complaints from viewers experiencing nausea during calm scenes. The soundtrack also incorporates animalistic vocal elements manipulated through analog tape. Cats, pigeons, and even goat vocalizations were slowed down, reversed, and stripped of identifiable patterns. These textures were woven lightly into the background, giving the impression of living walls. One sound engineer noted that these sessions caused several crew members to refuse overtime, claiming the audio made them feel restless in their skin. Another unsettling technique involved injecting irregular percussive anomalies, quiet knocks, taps, and shuffles recorded from the building where much of the film was shot. These noises were left unbalanced between channels, producing the sensation of someone moving behind the viewer. Despite the film's cult following, the original multi-track audio elements have never been publicly archived. The official soundtrack album excludes the subharmonic layers entirely, sparking rumors that Universal considered the underlying frequencies too aggressive for consumer formats. Fact 6. The Haunting of Julia, 1977. At first glance, The Haunting of Julia appears to rely on grief-driven atmosphere rather than explicit horror. But beneath its quiet sorrow lies an audio strategy far more manipulative than the visuals suggest. The sound team built the film's dread through microtonal string clusters, subtle dissonances woven so carefully into the mix that viewers often sense them before they consciously notice them. Composer Colin Towns experimented with bow pressure techniques, scraping strings at angles intended to create a shimmering, unstable pitch, the kind that makes the listener's inner ear tighten. These cues are often placed under otherwise gentle scenes, creating an emotional contradiction that viewers register as unnatural sadness. Several musicians involved in the recording sessions later described the experience as emotionally draining, claiming the tones vibrated in uncomfortable parts of the body. An even stranger layer was created from processed children's vocal textures. These were not traditional choir lines. Instead, they were pitch-shifted and time-stretched into elongated breaths that sit just above the threshold of hearing. Engineers reported that the longest sessions produced headaches and mild vertigo. Adding to the unease, the ambient room tone was recorded using microphones positioned near household appliances and window frames, capturing subtle rattles from vibrations. When combined with the film's musical dissonance, these accidental noises created an impression of a house that breathed along with the characters. The soundtrack vinyl released in the late 1970 seconds omits most of these disturbing elements, leaving only the melodic lines. Fans who grew up with TV broadcasts often swear that the theatrical audio felt heavier, as if an invisible emotional weight pressed down from the speakers. Fact 7. The Nightcomers, 1971. Although best known as a prequel to The Turn of the Screw, The Nightcomers contains audio techniques that operate far outside traditional Gothic storytelling. The film appears calm on the surface, pastoral landscapes, slow pacing, and restrained performances, but beneath this quiet exterior lies a soundtrack designed to make the audience physically uneasy. The production relied heavily on location recordings made in old stone estates, capturing natural reverberations and unstable echoes. These spaces produced unpredictable resonances, especially when capturing footsteps or distant voices. Engineers noticed that certain hallways generated low-frequency rumbles unrelated to any intentional sound. Rather than cleaning them, they incorporated these anomalies as atmospheric beds. More unsettling was the use of asymmetric harmonic drones, created by bowing metal rods at irregular intervals. These drones don't follow musical structure. They wobble in pitch and warp unpredictably, mimicking the emotional instability of the film's characters. Some early viewers reported feeling tense or disoriented during dialogue scenes where nothing was happening, unaware that the drones were subtly interfering with their physiological equilibrium. The film also features isolated child vocalizations recorded in an unheated room. The cold caused slight tremors in the voices, producing a brittle, almost spectral texture. When these samples were stretched or shifted, they created a sensation described by one editor as a cold draft in the soundtrack. Because The Nightcomers wasn't marketed as a horror film, these audio choices went largely unnoticed, but viewers sensitive to sound often recall an inexplicable unease. Today, the film stands as a case study in how quiet, non-threatening visuals can be weaponized through sound, creating dread through acoustic suggestion rather than overt scares. Fact: 8. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Although often hailed for its dreamy, ambiguous atmosphere, Let's Scare Jessica to Death hides one of the most quietly disturbing soundtracks of its era. Much of the film's terror stems from its dissonant whisper motifs, a pattern that blurs the line between Jessica's mental instability and something genuinely supernatural lurking in the environment. Rather than using traditional music cues, the sound team recorded dozens of close mic breaths, vocal tremors, and half-formed syllables spoken by multiple actors. These fragments were then layered into drifting clusters that appear suddenly, vanish, then reappear at different pitches. The result is a sense that voices are circling Jessica and the audience, whispering just out of comprehension. Equally disturbing are the low-fidelity ambient textures captured using malfunctioning tape recorders. These devices introduced warbled pitch fluctuations and sub-audio thumps that made the surrounding environment feel haunted, as though the land itself were pulsing. In certain shots, the ambient tone subtly bends downward, creating a physiological reaction associated with dread and dissociation. One sound mixer described the process as collecting ghosts, explaining that the analog equipment often produced noises none of them remembered recording. Some of these artifacts made it into the final cut because they enhanced the film's psychological distortion. Fact 9. The Legacy of Satan, 1974. Though marketed as an occult exploitation film, The Legacy of Satan contains an audio element so peculiar that even seasoned cult film historians acknowledge something off about it. The film's sound design feels cheap at first, but attentive listeners notice patterns that don't align with normal musical structure, frequencies that float outside the harmony, out-of-sync pulses, and whispered fragments that don't match the actors' mouths. These anomalies come from an unusual decision by the sound team. During post-production, they experimented with broken synthesizers, instruments that malfunctioned due to unstable voltage. Instead of repairing them, engineers recorded the machines producing warped glides, unstable oscillations, and random bursts of subharmonic tones. These recordings were then layered beneath chants, giving the rituals a kind of sonic sickness. The mix also includes reverse-spliced tape loops containing clipped bits of dialogue and breaths. These loops were intentionally left rough, with audible tape hiss and splice clicks. When played at very low volume, they created the illusion of someone muttering in the background. Viewers in early screenings reported a sense of paranoia, feeling as though conversations were happening behind them, even though the theater was nearly silent. One editor later revealed that the final mix became so cluttered with these experimental layers that the composers refused to credit certain tracks. The film's soundtrack, never officially released, omits much of the unsettling audio. Fans who meticulously compare the theatrical version with home releases swear that modern transfers feel emptier, lacking the oppressive undercurrent that once made the film feel dangerous. While not widely known today, The Legacy of Satan remains a prime example of audio contamination, a film where broken machinery, distorted chants, and subhuman frequencies combine to create fear beyond its budget. Fact 10. Don't Look Now, 1973. Don't Look Now is widely praised for its hypnotic visuals, but its sound design is where the film reveals its most disquieting intentions. Rather than relying on traditional horror cues, the production crafted a sonic environment that feels quietly hostile, as though Venice itself were whispering warnings through its canals. The film's most unnerving technique comes from its use of fragmented acoustic textures, clipped breaths, splashes, footsteps on wet stone, and soft fabric rustles recorded with extreme intimacy. These sounds were then layered, repeated, or subtly shifted in pitch to mimic the sensation of memory collapsing into itself. Viewers often recall hearing things that aren't visually present, like distant echoes or faint voices, even though the soundtrack contains nothing explicit. Instrumentally, the score leans into dislocated piano phrases, melodies that start gently but derail into irregular intervals. Composer Pino Donaggio used unstable tape delay to smear certain notes, producing a subtly warped emotional tone. In several scenes, the piano appears to fall out of sync with the environment, creating an unsettling disconnect between the viewer and what they see on screen. Perhaps most disturbing is the film's manipulation of silence. Rather than providing relief, silent moments are punctuated by distant, barely audible environmental sounds, a boat creaking in the fog, water lapping unevenly, or wind slipping through narrow alleys. Experts in sound mixing note that these cues sit near the lower threshold of hearing, nudging the brain to remain alert even during calm scenes. While Don't Look Now has been analyzed for its editing and symbolism, Its audio remains a powerful, often overlooked tool of psychological manipulation, quietly tightening around the viewer like a whispered premonition. Fact 11. The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie, 1972. Although not marketed as a horror film, The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie has gained a quiet cult reputation for leaving viewers disturbed in ways no one could explain. The film itself plays like a psychological thriller, yet the discomfort it creates is disproportionate to the imagery, leading many to look more closely at its soundtrack, where the true menace lies. The audio team pursued a minimalist approach, but minimalist didn't mean simple. They crafted long, nearly silent stretches filled with microtextures, distant hums, isolated resonances, and faint environmental loops captured from real, abandoned rural locations. These recordings weren't cleaned. Instead, they were intentionally left with impurities, electrical buzz, wind distortion, and mic rattle. When layered beneath dialogue, they produced the subconscious suggestion that the world of the film was decaying. More unsettling, though, was the use of irregular heartbeat rhythms sampled from an old medical training device. These pulses were stretched and filtered into non-musical patterns, creating a throb that doesn't quite match human physiology. For certain viewers, especially in theaters with good low-end speakers, these cues induced mild anxiety and a tightening in the sternum. One archived interview notes that the director insisted on using sound you feel rather than hear. That philosophy shows in moments where nothing overt occurs, yet the air feels dense. Some viewers left mid-screening complaining of unease, even though the film contains no supernatural events. Ironically, the film's audio remains one of its least discussed aspects, largely because no official soundtrack was ever produced. All that survives are scattered anecdotes, and the film itself still humming with the subtle, disquieting rhythms that made audiences uneasy more than 50 years ago. Fact 12. The Witching, 1972. The Witching is one of those early 70 seconds occult thrillers that feels cheap on the surface but leaves an oddly heavy aftertaste. Much of that weight comes from its unreleased audio experiments, a set of cues so strange that the film's composer refused to include them in any soundtrack album. For years, fans suspected missing audio elements, and crew interviews eventually confirmed. Several unsettling layers were deliberately buried inside the mix. The sound design leaned heavily on detuned chimes, metallic resonances, and throat-singing samples recorded at a pitch far below human comfort ranges. In several scenes, you can feel a subtle pressure in your chest, even though nothing loud is happening. This effect came from an old analog oscillator set at roughly 17 to 19 Hz, a range connected to mild vertigo, panic responses, and a sensation of impending presence. According to one assistant engineer, the wave caused coffee cups to vibrate slightly on the mixing desk. More disturbing was a series of spoken incantations recorded by an uncredited voice actor. These lines were cut up, reversed, time-stretched, and then mixed so low they register more as a physical sensation than a sound. Actors who attended the early screenings mentioned an odd discomfort in scenes where nothing frightening was supposed to occur. One performer even claimed he kept hearing breathing beside him during the ritual sequences, though the theater was silent. Today, the hardest material to track down isn't the film, it's the original audio elements, which were reportedly removed from the vault during a studio reorganization and never returned. Whether lost or locked away, The Witching's most sinister ingredients remain hidden, echoing only in the uneasy reactions of those who heard them in 1972. Fact 13. The Legacy, 1978. While The Legacy is often labeled as an occult thriller wrapped in glossy late 70 seconds aesthetics, its most unsettling moments come not from spells or gore, but from its sound design, which is far more experimental than the studio ever admitted. Beneath the film's elegant cinematography lies a soundtrack woven with whispers, phasing tones, and hidden vocal textures that seem to crawl across the auditory field. Composer Michael J. Lewis created a score that appears traditional on the surface, but engineers revealed that several cues were built using multi-layered whisper tracks recorded by the cast and crew in a darkened studio. These whispers were then slowed down, reversed, and filtered through analog tape until they produced a barely identifiable human texture, something between breath, wind, and a voice trying to form words. Some sound operators refused to work on late-night sessions, claiming the recordings felt too alive. The production also incorporated irregular binaural panning, shifting certain high-frequency sounds unpredictably from left to right. Viewers sitting in specific seats during early screenings described sudden tingling in the temples or a sensation as if someone was leaning close to whisper directly into their ears. One theater in Chicago reportedly lowered the playback volume after multiple complaints of dizziness. A further oddity, the soundtrack album released in 1979 excludes nearly all of these experimental textures, featuring only the orchestral portions. The missing elements have fueled decades of speculation, especially since Lewis himself stated he was not comfortable revisiting the tapes. On screen, the story plays like a stylish, supernatural mystery. But beneath the surface, the legacy hides a covert acoustic spell, one designed to bypass logic and speak directly to the listener's primitive fear centers. Fact 14. Burnt Offerings, 1976. For most viewers, Burnt Offerings is remembered as a slow-burning haunted house drama. But those who experienced it in theaters during its original run often describe something far stranger, a feeling of heaviness that settled in the room long before anything frightening appeared on screen. The source of that unease wasn't the imagery, it was the sound. The film's sound team experimented with a technique that was barely documented in the 1,970 seconds, embedding low-frequency pulses beneath the orchestral score. These tones hovered around the edge of human perception, not loud enough to hear consciously, but powerful enough to trigger biological reactions. Several projectionists reported headaches and stomach tension after repeated screenings, while others said the film made the air feel thicker. According to crew anecdotes, the sound engineers used analog oscillators to generate infrasound waves, then blended them with harmonics from bowed cymbals, reversed piano strings, and whispered breaths sourced from multiple actors. Because these elements were recorded to tape and then degraded, the final texture had a faint rotting quality, like something alive decaying inside the mix. One mixer later recalled that he avoided certain sessions because the room felt hostile. This might explain a strange detail. The full original audio stems have never been released, and the soundtrack album omits the eerie low-frequency bed entirely. Fans who compare home releases to the theatrical version insist that modern mixes feel cleaner, almost as if the house's malevolent presence has been softened. What remains undeniable is that Burnt Offerings manipulates not just fear, but physiology. The real haunting happens inside the listener's nervous system long before anything appears on screen. Fact 15. The Shout, 1978. There are horror films that use music to unsettle the mind, but The Shout is one of the rare cases where the sound itself becomes the monster. This British psychological chiller revolves around a mysterious drifter who claims he learned a death shout from Aboriginal rituals, a sound capable of killing anyone who hears it. The film treats this as fiction, but behind the camera, the sound department pushed the story far too close to reality. The production experimented with layered, abrasive vocalizations, combining guttural human screams, metallic scraping, and extremely low-frequency tones that hovered just above the threshold of human perception. Several crew members reported nausea and migraines during mixing sessions, describing the sound as pressurizing the skull. One assistant editor said he could feel air compressing even though the room was silent. At least 2 members of the team refused to listen to the full track more than once. The composer, Tony Banks of Genesis, used techniques that were unusual even by 1,970-second standards: reversed vocal loops, pitch-shifted breaths, and drones built from sub-audio frequencies. According to later interviews, he felt physically unwell during certain sessions and refused to recreate the full mix for any future releases. This may explain why The Shout's most notorious sound has never appeared on any official soundtrack album, despite demand from collectors. Viewers at the time couldn't articulate why the film disturbed them, especially since its visuals are relatively tame, but those sensitive to infrasound described headaches, anxiety, and a sensation as if someone was standing directly behind me. Whether intentional or accidental, The Shout remains one of the few horror films where the audio inflicts the real damage. Bonus film The Shiver of the Vampires, 1971. While often remembered for its surreal visuals and psychedelic costumes, The Shiver of the Vampires hides one of the most aggressively experimental soundtracks of early 70s European horror. At first glance, the film appears to be a gothic fever dream laced with erotic imagery, but beneath the surface lies a sonic experiment that pushed analog equipment to its breaking point, creating audio textures that many viewers found more unsettling than anything happening on screen. The score, composed by the progressive rock band Acanthus, was built around improvised electronic sessions recorded late at night in a studio filled with malfunctioning amplifiers, unstable oscillators, and prototype synthesizers. These devices produced inconsistent waveforms that drifted unpredictably in pitch, creating a shimmering, nauseating sonic bed that seemed to buckle under its own weight. Musicians later recalled that some of the tones created during these sessions couldn't be replicated even hours later, as the equipment behaved differently every time it powered on. The soundtrack also features reverse-played guitar passages, layered with low-frequency rumble captured from the building's electrical system. These tones were not intentionally musical, they were sonic accidents, the byproduct of an overburdened power grid feeding the studio's hardware. The resulting mix radiates a sense of bodily discomfort, as though the air itself is vibrating in irregular pulses. Even more disturbing are the whisper loops woven beneath the music, snippets of breathing, half-laughs, and clipped vocalizations fed through delay units until they smear into smudges of human presence. These textures appear and disappear without warning, creating the impression of unseen entities moving between the instruments. Despite its cult following, the original audio elements have never been fully released or restored. Every modern version differs slightly, suggesting that the film's unsettling soundscape was a product of unrepeatable analog chaos, a mix that existed fully only once in the moment it was created. If this journey into forbidden frequencies and hidden sound experiments left you feeling just a little uneasy, that's exactly how these films were designed to work. And there are countless more forgotten horror stories buried in the archives, waiting to be uncovered. So, if you want to keep exploring the strange, the obscure, and the unsettling corners of cinema history, make sure to subscribe to The Night Shriek. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves the shadows, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.